120. What I mean by that is organ donation after someone's passed away. There's another discussion about, are you allowed to donate a kidney when you're alive? That's not our topic of today. The topic is, if people fill out a donor card, what are halachic guidelines for filling out a donor card? So let me just begin with a disclaimer that we're not going to be giving a psak halacha today and saying this is what you should do, or you should do it like this or do it like that. We're just going to be looking at sources, some of the makorot, to understand how we define the end of life. Because as soon as we understand how we define the end of life, then you'll know if you're allowed to remove organs, or if you're not allowed to remove organs. Because a heart, for example, you can't, once the heart stops bleeding, then you can't, once the heart stops beating, you can't remove the heart once it stopped beating. So the question is, if we define death as the heart stops beating, then you'd never be able to do a heart transplant. But if you defined death not as the heart stops beating, but as brain death, so then maybe you would be allowed to do a... So we're going to look at different definitions of how to define the end of life. But before we get to the discussion of defining the end of life, I want to talk about just some halachic factors to consider why it might be a good idea or not a good idea to donate organs. Okay? So, there are 4 reasons that people bring why you should not donate organs. 4 that I saw. 4 reasons not to donate organs. 1 second. I thought, before we get to that... Oh, okay, so 4 reasons why we shouldn't. Notice, if you just have a quick look through them, there's no issur on not being buried whole. I don't know if any of you ever heard that. Some people think you shouldn't donate organs because if after 120 the body needs to be buried whole, and if you remove an organ then the person's not whole anymore, and then resurrection of the dead, they won't have that organ. I'm not even sure where that's from. Have you ever heard that argument? So it's not a halachic argument. I've never seen any. Maybe it does appear, but I've never seen any halachic basis for that. I think that's more of a mystical idea, but it doesn't seem.
The Egyptians used to do.
Huh?
The Egyptians used to do.
They
preserve all the organs and stuff.
Oh, so this is. Yeah, you're quite right.
Take it with them to the afterlife.
The truth is, the afterlife is a really big deal in Egyptian culture, which is very appropriate for the parashiot that we're studying at the moment. But that whole idea is not an idea that appears anywhere in Jewish sources, Jewish halachic sources, that is. Okay, the first issue, though, there are 4 issues. The first issue is that you're not allowed to derive benefit from a dead body. The halacha, this is the Bet Yosef. Bet Yosef, as you know, is Rav Yosef Karo, who subsequently wrote the Shulchan Aruch. He writes in his commentary on the Torah, Met v'tachri chava, dead body, and the clothing with which a person is buried, asurim b'hana'ah, you're not allowed to derive benefit from them. But as is mentioned in a few places, Avodah Zarah, Kaftet Amud Bet, and Sanhedrin Mem Zayin Amud Bet. So Avodah Zarah, page 29b, and in Sanhedrin 47b. Veloshana ben meit goy lemet Yisrael. It makes no difference whether the person is a Jew or a non-Jew. You're not allowed to derive benefit from a dead body. So here this would be, if I'm taking out an organ and using that organ, I'd be deriving benefit from a dead body. That's number 1. Number 2 is halanat hamet, delaying of the burial. I don't know if you know about this, but here in Israel in particular, but elsewhere as well, we are very particular to bury the dead at the first possible opportunity. There is an isur in halacha of delaying burial, halanat hamet, based on a very interesting Gemara. The Gemara in Sanhedrin tells us, it's in source number 3, a terrible story about 2 guys, 2 brothers, twin brothers, 2 identical twin brothers. One of them was the king, and the other one was a gangster. And the gangster was caught, tried, and sentenced to hanging. So they took this this gangster, and he was hanged in the public square. And everybody came to the public square, saw the body hanging in the square, and didn't realize it was the gangster. They all thought it was the king. So then the people of the town said, quick, take it down, because everyone thinks that the king has just been hanged. You follow? Now, how's that? Do you know, this is such a powerful, powerful, powerful analogy. We sweet, holy people, every human being is created b'tzelem Elokim. We are kiviyachol, if you can even understand what that means, God's twin. And therefore, a human body, a dead human body, above, sort of above ground, is a disgrace of our twin, who is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Isn't that a powerful idea? Is that crazy? And therefore, you're never allowed to delay burial. Now, here in Jerusalem, they are particularly careful about this. They don't allow, if somebody passes away, they shouldn't have a body in Jerusalem overnight, which is why the cemeteries in Jerusalem run 24 hours a day. So you could go to a funeral here in Jerusalem at 3 o'clock in the morning, because as soon as someone passes away, the burial takes place as soon as possible. Other than on Shabbat. On Shabbat, there's nothing you can do, but other than on Shabbat. And the reason is because of this prohibition of delay of burial. So obviously, if you're gonna be extracting organs, I want to prioritize on the burial. It might delay it because of this procedure that you have to perform. Okay, that's the second issue. The third issue is nivul hamet. Nivul hamet is disgrace of the dead. And I don't know if you remember this, but when we discussed the topic of pikuach nefesh, saving a life, we quoted the responsum of Rav Yecheskel Landau. But you don't have to remember this, Simcha, because I think you weren't here. Rav Yecheskel Landau was the chief rabbi of Prague in the 18th century, 1700s, nachon? That's the 18. He was in the chief rabbi in the 18th century, and there was a big operation that was performed in England. Somebody did they removed gallstones, and when they removed the gallstones, a person died during the operation, and one of the doctors wanted to know, can they do an autopsy on this body in order to figure out why the person died, so that when they do the next person, they remove their gallstones, they won't make the same mistake twice. And they asked that question to the Noda B'Yehuda. But what's the premise of the question? The premise is you're not allowed to cut up, you're not allowed to do an autopsy, because an autopsy is nivul hamet. Now, our discussion today is not about the pikuach nefesh, about whether that would allow you to do this operation or not. But what's clear from the question is that it's nivul hamet. You're not allowed to do an autopsy on a dead body. You follow, because it's a disgrace of the dead. All of these things, as you know, have exceptions. The Gemara's got a very famous example. If, let's say, it's a terrible story. Let's say somebody's murdered, right? And we're not sure if Reuven killed him or Shimon killed him. So you're allowed to exhume the body and to examine the body if there would be evidence on the body that would implicate either Reuven or Shimon. That would be pikuach nefesh, because one of them may be charged for murder, and then if doing this autopsy would be able to establish the guilt of someone else, you could then save that person from death. So it's a crazy sort of situation there, because there you're saving pikuach nefesh, but his life is only in danger because the Beit Din will put him to death for killing somebody. You follow? It's not. The danger to his life is a punishment rather than punishment from Beit Din. Anyway. From that, we see there are exceptions to the rule, but in general, you're not allowed to cause disgrace to the dead. The fourth one is stealing. You're not sure who it belongs to. Who does the body belong to? Is it mine to give? Is this hard? Maybe it belongs to him. Who says you'd be allowed to give it to somebody else? Okay, so those are all factors to consider. The reason to permit it, though, is because we have a responsibility to look after other people. Nachon? Lo telech rachil b'mecha, lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. If somebody else is in pain, We have a responsibility to look after them. And the truth is, this idea of Lot Amod Adam Re'echa, obviously Pikuach Nefesh waves aside all of these concerns. And therefore, if I'm in a situation of Pikuach Nefesh, there's absolutely no doubt that you'd be allowed to waive all of these halachic concerns in order to save a life. Beseder? The only thing you wouldn't be allowed to do is end the life of the person in order to save someone else's life. You follow? And for that, therefore, we have to enter a fascinating discussion into the definition of death. Okay, so we're going to look at two positions. The first one we're going to look at is the Mishnah and the Gemara that define death, a very interesting case in Masechet Yuma. Then afterwards we're going to look at a very, very interesting situation that happened in, again, same time as in Nodab Yehuda actually, or just slightly just after he lived, in the 18th century. And in the 18th century there was sort of a new definition of when death occurs. And then afterwards we're going to look at how modern authorities play between these two definitions. You follow? So we're going to look at two definitions. Is that clear? Two definitions. And then once we look at these two definitions, we're going to see how modern or halachic authorities, do they follow this definition or that definition, and the halachic ramifications of each of those two definitions. Joy? Okay, any questions until now? Okay, we're going to go. Look at this. This is the Mishnah. Do you see it's in source number 6? You can't see that. You can see it's half a 6, and believe the next one says 7, even though you can't really see it. Okay, so look at this, number 6. The Mishnah in Yuma, chapter 8, Mishnah 7. So the Mishnah says like this: Misha nafla alav mapolet. Somebody who is walking and an avalanche falls. Like a guy's going for a hike, and it's on Shabbat, and an avalanche of rocks lands on this guy. Now, just know, sweet, wonderful people, the cases in Mishnayot are not often practical cases, but they're cases created by the Tanaim in order to make halachic points. You follow? Okay, so just bear that in mind as we discuss this. So a guy's walking, and an avalanche of rocks lands on him. Safek hu sham, safek eino sham. We're not sure. Maybe he's there, maybe he isn't there. Safek chai, maybe he's alive. Safek mate, maybe he's not alive. Safek oved kochavim, safek Yisrael, maybe he's Jewish, maybe he's not Jewish. So what do you do? So it's Shabbat, nachon? So all these rocks are muksa. So the question is, are you allowed to move these rocks or not? Mefachim, very good. Mefachim alav et hakal. So you're allowed to remove this pile from him. Mitzau chai, if he's still alive, mefachim alav, you're allowed to remove them. Ve'imet, but if this guy is dead, yanichuhu. So then people would obviously remain, because you're not allowed to leave a dead body. But if it turns out that the person is no longer in this world, so then you can no longer remove the stones, because the only reason why you could move them is to save this guy's life. But if it's quite clear that he's left this world, you can't remove the rocks. Do you see how but this forces us to now the Gemara is going to ask, well, how do we know if he's alive? Isn't that amazing? So the Gemara is now going to define life for us based on this crazy case. So this crazy case didn't happen, but it's a way for the Gemara to describe death. You hear that? Now I might also add in parentheses, as you know, Mishnah, the Torah, the oral law was written to be remembered. You follow? And therefore stories is a much easier way for me to remember the law. You understand? If I want to remember a storybook, I'm much more likely to remember the cases than if I were just to read dry statutory law. You follow? So that's why the Mishnah is presented in this way. So the Gemara asks this brilliant question. Tana Rabbana, the rabbis asked, Ad Heichan Hu Bodek. Where do you check? You follow? I mean, how do we know? What check do you do upon, and then on the basis of that check, you'll say, either, I'm afraid to say he's left this world and we're going to stop removing the... Like, what check would you do in order to make that decision? You hear the question?
Mm-hmm.
So he says like this, Ad Chotmo. Chotmo, do you know what Chotmo means? Chotam is your, like you check if he's breathing. V'yesh omrim ad libo. Some people say you check if his heart. Le'inyan pikuach nefesh, ikar chiyuta ba'apehu. For pikuach nefesh, the main place where you are alive is in your nose. Tichtiv al kol asher nishmat ruach chayim ba'apo. Whoever is breathing. From which we see that the definition of being alive, according to the Mishnah, seems to be if the guy is breathing. If somebody is breathing, they are alive. If someone is not breathing, then they've left this world. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Okay, now look at this. The Shulchan Aruch says, Afilu mitzau merotzet, she'enu yechol lichyot ela lefi sha'ah. Even if we see the person's in a very bad way, they're only going to live for another very short amount of time. Nevertheless, mefakchim uvodkim ad chotmo, you continue checking. Im lo hirgishu b'chotmo chayot az vaday met. If you see there's no life in his mouth, meaning he stopped breathing, then vaday met. Do you see that? Then he certainly left this world. Lo shana pagu b'roshot chila v'lo shana pagu b'raglav. It doesn't matter where the rocks hit him. But if the person is no longer capable of independent breathing, then he's left this world. So the definition, according to this, of death is somebody who stopped breathing.
Mm-hmm.
Is that clear from the Mishnah? Any questions on the Mishnah?
Yes.
Yes.
What about if he's like the guy is like not totally dead, but he's just the pulse is just slow and it's fainted that somehow it happens somehow in the hospitals. They thought that the corpse is dead already, but they realize when they bury the corpse and the corpse is like still moving in the coffin, and there's like scratches in the coffin.
Oh yeah.
And like after that's why they have like
Yeah.
they decided we have to leave the corpse for 3 days just to make sure it's dead already. So what if this is the case? Like you're not sure he is dead when you say he's dead, he's not breathing, but all of a sudden he's alive.
Yeah, so this is very complicated. According to the Mishnah and the Gemara, we define death as we saw over here from ba'apot, like is the person capable of breathing or not. So I've got two things to say on that. We're going to come to this 3-day business in a minute. It was a big problem in the Middle Ages. In Europe, people were being buried alive. In fact, in England, and maybe in Europe too, when people were buried, it's such a gloomy topic. Oh, I apologize, I'm sorry. But they used to bury people with a string in the coffin. Do you know about this? There was a string, and the string was above the grave, there was a bell. And you would put, if the guy turns out they're breathing, they could put a ring on the bell and say, oh, sorry. I feel terrible, I'm so sorry. And then you're like, the guy, you remove the guy from the coffin. That's how awful they must have been. I'm sure people were buried alive. Yet it's a very, very difficult thing to know about whether the guy stopped breathing or not. It's a very, very difficult measure. In fact, I looked, because somebody mentioned, in our trailer for today, somebody asked last week about, like resuscitation. Let's say somebody stopped breathing, there's no pulse, and then you resuscitate them, and then were they dead and now they've come back to life? So according to this, yes, that is exactly the case. That if somebody's incapable of, if somebody's pulse is gone, and somehow through, through machinery, you're able to re-establish a pulse after it's gone. So then there was somebody who was dead, and if there were a Cohn in the room, the Kohanim would have left the room. But then if they re-established a pulse, the guy came back to life again. You hear that? So it's a very, 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 very difficult thing to understand. I mean, just to understand this a little bit better, I think my brother is a pharmacist. And I once spoke to him about this years ago, and he said then, but I'm not sure if it's changed much since then, that the success rate of resuscitation is very, very low. Meaning once the pulse has gone and gone for a few minutes, so then the chances of re-establishing a pulse are very, very low. But it does seem that it's possible. So you could have a situation where somebody would halachically be dead because they're no longer able to breathe, and then I don't know what they do to jolt the heart back into action again, and then the person the heart stopped working, and they were able to jolt the heart back into working again. So that's somebody that would have been halachically dead, and then they would come back to life again. Does that make sense? But I'm not sure if that happens. I'm not sure that the sort of the rates of success. And it's really not an area that I know very much about. Okay, that's the first comment about resuscitation based on breathing. But according to what we said just now, it's a very, very difficult thing to measure. Like you said, people were probably buried alive, because they stopped breathing, but then somehow it looked like it was irreversible. Turns out it wasn't irreversible. There is just in brackets. There's something known as brain death. Brain death is when there's no connection between the brain and the body anymore. I think once somebody is brain dead, you can't resuscitate after someone is brain dead. So somebody, like the pulse could stop, and I don't know. You might not have the equipment, but there's certainly no pulse. So they would be halachically dead, and then you could re-establish. You could only potentially be successful in re-establishing a pulse if the person were not brain dead. But if somebody starts breathing and they are brain dead, then that really is irreversible. Is that clear?
I mean, irreversible.
Resuscitation only works before brain death. But once someone is brain dead, then brain dead means that there's no communication between the body and the brain. Once that happens, then resuscitation will never work.
Oh, okay, so it's an emergency situation.
Yeah, resuscitation works after there's something called, when someone stops breathing, that is clinical death, because they're no longer breathing, but not yet brain dead. So somebody who's clinically dead could come back to life through CPR. But somebody who is brain dead could not come back to life through CPR. Is that clear?
So, but the goof is still alive, and is he considered dead?
At which stage?
The body is still alive. Brain dead, but the body is still breathing.
No, oh my gosh.
That's a different thing.
Oh, that is such $1 million question. Let's say someone's brain dead and they're attached to a machine and they're breathing, like a artificial ventilator. Are they alive or dead? Oh, that is such a brilliant question. Let's come now to your question. So this was a halachic definition in the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch, as you know, was written about 400 years ago, in the 1700s. And you see what it says over here, as we see, Im lo hirgishu b'chotmo chiyut, as vadai met. Once you see no breathing, then he's certainly dead. Lo shana pago b'rosho. Doesn't matter if he was hit by rocks in his head or his legs. I mean, you don't look at the wound, but do you see that? As soon as there's no chiyut, there's no breathing, then vadai dead. Is that clear? Okay, that is a Shulchan Aruch. Now we get to your question. There was a very, very interesting and complicated situation. One of the most interesting periods in Jewish history, for me at least, is 250 years ago. Just when Jews who had been in the ghetto for hundreds of years were beginning to leave the ghetto, there was a very, very, very interesting case. There was a city called Mecklenburg, I think. Where was it? Mecklenburg. I think it was Mecklenburg.
Yeah.
Okay, so what happened was that I'm not sure if it's written here, but let's say it is written here. Oh, good. Okay. So listen to this crazy situation. There was a city called Mecklenburg, and what happened was a bit like what Yosef was saying. They were being a little bit hasty in burying people, and the city of Mecklenburg got a bit worried that they were burying too many people alive. When you say burying too many people alive, I imagine one person would be too many people to bury alive. But it was not working, meaning the system of they stop breathing, let's bury them, was not working, and therefore in this city they made an enactment. And the enactment was that they were going to keep everybody in the morgue for 3 days. They had a morgue, and they would keep everybody in the morgue for 3 days. If there's no movement for 3 days, then we could be quite sure that the guy has left this world, and then you can bury them. And there was a big uproar in the Jewish community because, as we mentioned previously, you're not allowed to delay burial. So somebody passes away, and then 3 days later, only 3 days later, would you be allowed to do a levaya. As you know, in the laws of Avelut, the Shiva, the 7-day mourning period, only begins after the burial. But from the death to a burial, the halachic status is of an onen, that you don't perform any positive mitzvot. So you're really in an impossible situation. The Jewish community can't wait 3 days in order to bury the dead. There was a huge uproar. Now there was this scholar called Moses Mendelssohn. Have you heard of Moses Mendelssohn? Moses Mendelssohn was a very interesting character. He was an observant Jew, but he had very unorthodox ideas about halakha and about how to, continue Jewish life.
He's the one who founded the which one is it? Reform, right?
Yeah, he was certainly.
I think he's the one who really started the movement.
Yeah, could be.
Yeah,
could be. He wasn't accepted was not accepted by the halachic Jewish community. That's for sure. He lived at the same time as a very important Gadol Hador called Rav Moshe Sofer. Have you heard of Rav Moshe Sofer? He wrote a book called Chatam Sofer. Interestingly, just in brackets, I only know this because it's in my neighborhood. There is a big dynasty of Chassidut actually, called Eroloi. Eroloi Chassidim are the grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren of the Chatam Sofer. They became even though this was a Litvish, not a Hasidic community, but his great-grandchildren became quite a big Hasidic community, and they happen to live today in my neighborhood in Katamoy. And his great-granddaughter, his name, or great-great-granddaughter, whose surname is Sofa, same as his surname. So our kinderlach used to babysit for them when they were kids. So this very strong family is still a very important leadership community even today in Israel. Next time any of you with us for Shabbos, we'll pop over to the Erloi shul after supper for a tish. Anyway, so this Rav Moshe, so the first one, as you see, who lived in the 19th century, between the 18th and passed away in the 19th century, he was asked about this ruling, and he said, you can't do it. You can't do it. You can't allow Jewish bodies to lay for 3 days. It's delaying of the burial. And he, in devising his ruling, came up with a new definition of how to determine when you're allowed to bury a body. Do you hear what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Now, if you look, I'm just under this biography of him that you should all read in your free time. He says like this. Do you see source number 9? Source number 9. Aval. Nevertheless, kol she'achar shemutal ke'even domem. As soon as the body is as hard as a stone, ve'ein bo shum devika, and there's no heartbeat, ve'im achar kach batel haneshima, ein lanu ela divrei toratenu hakadosha shu met. We rely on the Torah and we say this person is dead. V'lo yalinu oto v'ametameh lo imhu Cohen lokeh achar ha'atra'ah. If it's a Cohen is there, he has to leave straight away. So Rav Moshe Sofer, responding to this terrible situation of people who wanted to delay the burial, said, in Jewish law, we're not going to wait for 3 days. Because we're not going to delay the burial. What are we going to do? We're going to check if there's no heartbeat. As soon as a heart stops beating and the body is as hard as a stone, then we're going to say that person is dead and we're going to bury straight away. So he's adding a new definition of what it means to be dead in order to allow us to bury the dead immediately. But he's going beyond what we saw in the Mishnah and in the Gemara. The Mishnah and Gemara said, how do we define death? By stopping to breathe. Here, it's not about breathing, it's about heartbeat. As long as there's a heartbeat, the person is still alive. You hear that? So it means, according to Rav Moshe Sofer, if somebody was connected to an artificial ventilator, he's still alive. Even though they may not survive, even though it's impossible for them to come off, they'd never be capable. But as long as the heart is beating, you wouldn't be able to bury the dead. You follow that? Now, as you can imagine, this has huge, huge ramifications on how we decide what to do concerning organ transplant. Do we go by the definition we saw in the Mishnah of the Gemara, or do we go by the definition provided by Rav Moshe Sofer? You follow? If you follow the definition that we saw in the Mishnah of Gemara, you'll have a more lenient position about organ donation. But if you go by the position of Rav Moshe Sofer, you'll have a stricter opinion about organ donation. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
Any questions on what we said so far? Joy, happiness?
So, I just don't remember what we talk about what do you call it? Like the machine who keep
Artificial ventilator.
Yeah, this is very costly.
Yeah.
And what if it's time like that the family doesn't have any
Excellent question.
money at all?
Yeah. If we follow the position of Rav Moshe Sofer, that the person is still alive, that means you can't turn off the machine. Nachon, because we believe the guy's still alive. If you believe that he's still alive, then you can't turn off the machine, right?
Okay.
But it could be on for years. So Rav Moshe Feinstein actually has a pitaron, solution to that. The machines are connected to gas canisters. Well, not gas, whatever it is, oxygen, because they're pumping oxygen into the lungs, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is, so the oxygen isn't a limitless supply. So you're not allowed to turn off the machine. You wait till the container of oxygen runs out, and then you don't need to refill the oxygen. You follow? Well, like once it becomes clear that the person is brain dead, so therefore then as we said earlier, when someone's brain dead, so you'll never be able to artificially resuscitate them because they won't become capable of breathing. So once someone is brain dead, you can't turn off the machine. Because even though they're brain dead, according to the Khatam Sofer, their heart's still beating. You can't turn off the machine. Turning off the machine will cause their heart to stop beating. So therefore, you just don't switch the oxygen tank when it ends. Once that oxygen tank, then sort of their life will come to an end. Yeah, I must say this is such a morbid topic.
There's a case of a guy who was brain dead, and his wife would come in and talk to him every day. And the doctor said, he's brain dead. We're just keeping his heart going and oxygen, keeping oxygen in his body. And so he's dead. He's dead. And they decided not to pull the plug. And she came in all the time, talked to him, and then eventually what happened was he started blinking, and he started making sounds, and then slowly they realized he was had some sort of consciousness, and then he started waking up, and So it's kind of like changed how doctors have to think about brain death, because this guy, once he came back, he remembered certain things that his wife would tell him while he was
Oh
brain
my
dead.
gosh.
He had like memories from it, and so like I don't know. I guess the research that they're trying to look at now is that like when you're brain dead is actually like a survival mechanism for your body, and your brain has the ability to repair itself. So they're looking at now like how
Who,
quickly
when,
cells
how long ago did that story happen?
I don't know. It was within the last 20 years.
Oh wow! So when I'm really not an expert on these things. The way I understand brain death is not that the brain is dead. Brain death means you have a head and you have a body. There's also, this is like an important point in your body over here, and this is where the brain communicates with the body. So the communication center between the brain and the body isn't functioning.
Right.
But it could be that the brain in itself is functioning perfectly, and the
Right.
body, through artificial ventilation, also working properly. But there's no. It's a bit like he's decapitated, but the head may be functioning as a system, and the body might also be functioning as a system. Neither of them are necessarily dead, but they're not communicating with one another. That's what brain death is.
Yeah. So
I read a story. I think it was back in 2018. There was a kid, 13-year-old kid, who was brain dead, and a day before his organ donation, he woke up. It made news that time.
You mean they were about to remove his organs?
Yeah, and he woke up.
Oh my gosh.
It was considered brain dead.
That is crazy. Okay, so thankfully, we're gonna look at we're gonna look at different opinions now. Different opinions now about whether you'd be allowed. You understand the ramifications of it are as follows. If I say that as soon as I'm incapable of breathing, then I'm dead. So then when someone someone's brain dead, they're no longer able, but they are irreversibly unable to breathe, right? But the heart may still be beating. So I would be allowed to remove this beating heart and transplant it into somebody else, because the heart may still be pumping blood around the body, even though the person's no longer breathing. But if we say it's about when the heart stops beating, so then I wouldn't be able to donate any, because as soon as the heart starts beating, then you'll be unable to transplant any organs. So that's really the key question, is whether we follow the definition of the Mishnah or whether we follow the definition followed by the Khatam Sofer. And it's really very, very complicated. Even within the opinions, we'll see in Rav Moshe Feinstein he has two responses, and they say different things. So let's look at the first one over here. The strict opinion is that is the Tzitz Eliezer. The Tzitz Eliezer is Rav Eliezer Waldenberg. Rav Eliezer Waldenberg lived here in Jerusalem. He was a Dayan on the Jerusalem Beit Din and an expert in Jewish medical ethics. He was one of the rabbis of the Sharei Tzedek Hospital here in Jerusalem. He didn't pass away that long ago, maybe in the last 5 or 6 years. Maybe a little bit longer, but not like very recently. And his response are called Tzitz Eliezer. And one of the big topics he wrote about was medical ethics. He writes like this, source number 10. Anu motzim somchim lo. He quotes the Khatam Sofer that we saw earlier. It's a well-known tshuva, because it's the one that's really the Khatam Sofer, as I mentioned, writing 250 years ago now. His responsa, 150 years ago, sorry. Anyway, writing about 200 years ago, sorry for driving you all mad here. Writing, when the Khatam Sofer wrote, he was responding to this whole Mecklenburg issue. Okay, so the Tzitz Eliezer, Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, quotes him. Kol she'ach, and he quotes it in verbatim. Nachon, 1 second. Hareis disfirle lehargon Khatam Sofer. The Khatam Sofer holds ביטול הנשימה מועילה לקבוע את המיטה רק אם בא לאחר שמוטל כאבן תומם ואין בו שום דביקה. we only measure whether someone is breathing after their heart has stopped beating. Because he says, the Khatam Sofer says, once his heart stopped beating and he's no longer breathing, then we can say he's certainly dead. In other words, if somebody stops breathing but the heart is still beating, then that person is still alive. You follow? Michlal hen ata shomei alav. Taha kol sheyesh bo dain eza tefika. Do you see that? As long as the heart is still beating, the ezo ever shu, meaning the blood is still being pumped through the body, einona mutal ke'even domem, and he's not hard like a stone. Azai chosheshin she'ulai hu yotzei min haklal. Maybe something miraculous is going to happen to him. V'yesh lachush shema odenu chai, and you should need to consider that this person is still alive. So the only person who we consider dead, says the Khatam Sofer, is somebody who is as hard as a stone. In other words, there's no blood pumping through the body anymore.
Cold.
Huh?
What is cold?
Cold. Yeah, cold.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Meaning before anything until that time, we're just not playing around with these things, says the Tzitz Eliezer. And he rules that you would not be allowed to perform organ donations. So he's very limiting on which organs you would be allowed to donate. You hear that? Okay. That's the strictest opinion. And that is the opinion of the Tzitz Eliezer. And he's based on the Khatam Sofer. Okay. The second opinion is Rav Moshe Feinstein. Now, Rav Moshe Feinstein lived in America. And he has two teshuvot. The first one, he rules that you're not allowed to, and the second one, he changes his mind. The first, as you see over here, the first heart transplant was performed in 1968. Very, very soon after that first one. I think the person lived just for a few days after the very first heart transplant. It didn't add a huge amount to their lives. He writes like this. This heart transplant, so people have started doing recently. He's probably writing the 860s, beginning of the 70s. You kill two people. You're taking the heart out from somebody who's still alive. Even the doctors who aren't sure whether the person is still alive. But they're so keen to do this performance, to perform this heart transplant, that they remove a heart, possibly from somebody who's in their last dying moments, but might end their life early. And then you put it into the body of somebody who's not going to survive. So you're killing the person from whom you took the heart, and you're killing the person into whom you are putting the heart to. And therefore, he ruled in 1970 that you're not allowed to do heart transplants. Is that clear? Okay. However, something changed in 1980. Rav Moshe Feinstein passed away, I think, in 1986. So this was towards the end of his life. A big deal happened in 1980. They discovered a drug, or they appreciated the power of a drug called cyclosporine. Now, cyclosporine, we have a defense mechanism in our bodies, right? Now, when something foreign enters our body, we expel it. And that normally would save us. However, when you're doing a transplant, you want the body to accept the transplant. And the reason why the operations were so unsuccessful between 1968 and 1980 is because whenever they would introduce this organ, a new organ, from somebody else's body into that person's body, so the body would reject the new organ, because that's what the body does. Whenever a foreign item, material enters the body, to preserve us, it does it for our sake. So this new drug lowered the immune system, so the body would not reject so forcefully, and the acceptance of these new organs went up dramatically, and with that, the success rate of heart transplants went up in a huge way. So people were surviving for days or weeks previously, A heart transplant from then onwards was adding years to people's lives. Now, in light of this development, and this is a very exciting halachic thing to consider, Rav Moshe Feinstein changed his mind. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that exciting? Because it just shows how in the lifetime of a Gadol Hador, in the lifetime of one of the leaders of the generation, new information caused him to reconsider his halachic ruling. Isn't that brilliant? Now look at that. This is source number 11. I heard from my son-in-law. My son-in-law is Harav HaGaon, Rav Moshe David Tendler. Now Rav Moshe David Tendler was a rabbi. As you see, he was also a doctor, an expert in Jewish medical ethics. His son-in-law, Rav Moshe David Tendler, passed away about a year ago. He was a very, very important writer on the topic of Jewish medical ethics in America. He taught in YU. Have you heard of that, Yeshiva University? I think he was a very, very important halachic figure there. Okay, so he was advised, Rav Moshe Feinstein was advised by his son-in-law, the top doctor, Rav Moshe Tendler. Here, and he says over there, Ha'aruchut kiblu rak et hagdarot hamavet she'igam tzodeket ledina. So he explained a new definition of death, which I think makes sense halachically. Hagdara shokrim laharofim ha'arbeit kritika, which is brain death. What he says, hafsaka hamuchletet hasofit shel pu'ulat hamoach, the irreversible cessation of brain activity. Shenikrat mitat hamoach. Do you see that? Brain death. I accept, says Rav Moshe Feinstein, the definition of brain death is the halachic definition of death. Whenever the doctors can confirm that the brain has irreversibly stopped functioning. Do you see that? Hafsaka hamuchletet hasofit shel pu'ulat ha. So the brain has irreversibly stopped functioning. That is nechshav mamash kenechtach rosho. It is decapitation. You follow? Decapitation is, there's no other way to call it, and therefore that would certainly be a good definition of death. Ritzon olam Rahman, we should know about these things. The body starts already to rot. Once you've come to clinical brain death, which he is defining, as we said, as irreversible cessation of brain function, then the person is dead. But the heart might still be pumping for a few more days through an artificial ventilator. Isn't that crazy? Mm-hmm. But once the person is effectively decapitated, because the brain is irreversibly stopped functioning, as long as he's no longer able to do independent breathing, meaning the brain is no longer working, then this person will be considered as dead. According to the second opinion of Rav Moshe Feinstein, I would be allowed to do heart transplants. Nachon? Because I could have a situation where the brain has irreversibly stopped functioning, but the heart is still pumping. So if the brain has irreversibly stopped functioning, but the heart is still pumping, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, I would be allowed to do organ transplant. So we see, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, a third definition. We have the definition from the Gemara and the Mishnah, which was about breathing. Then we had Rav Moshe Sofer, who spoke about the heart stops beating, and that was his Mecklenburg. And now we have Rav Moshe Feinstein, based on the findings of his son-in-law, the doctor, who says it's brain death, which is, for him, the irreversible functioning of the brain. A cessation of function of the brain. Is that clear? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the second position. So we have, in the modern halachic authorities, that is to say, the rabbis that wrote in the last 50 years. So Rav Eliezer Waldenberg, who says it's absolutely forbidden, based on the Chatam Sofer. And then the second responsum of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who says it's permitted, based on the definition of his son-in-law. Is that clear? And his son-in-law, Rav Moshe Tendler, was certainly a big proponent of organ donation, saying that he's following his father-in-law's ruling, which he advised his father-in-law, and based on the information that he gave his father-in-law then allowed organ donation. And now we come to it like a position in the middle. The position in the middle, you'll think, what is either yes or no? Like, what could possibly be another opinion here? But the third opinion is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach lived at the same time as Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein lived in America, and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach lived in Sha'arei Chesed, here in Jerusalem. But he was a very important posek, the halachic ruler for Sha'arei Tzedek Hospital. Like Rav Waldenberg was also very much involved in the hospital, but many of the doctors in Sha'arei Tzedek would turn to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach for their halachic guidance. So he was informed by many of the doctors. So his medical knowledge is based on his relationship with many of the doctors in Sha'arei Tzedek Hospital. Okay, so listen to what Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said. Af al pi kein hoil v'shaso poskim lo nizkar klal inyan shel mavet mochi. I've never seen in the Talmud or in any of the early poskim this idea of brain death. I mean, it doesn't appear. This is the third, as we mentioned, Rav Moshe Feinstein coming up with a new definition of death. But I, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, are perhaps not as bold. Meaning, I can't create a new definition. My definition has to be based on tradition. But there's no tradition that would say that brain death is death. It's not based on mission, it's not based on the Chatam Sofer, not based on people in previous generations. And this goes a bit to what Eov was saying earlier. I'm still not 100% convinced, says Rosh Shlomo Auerbach, that even when the doctors say that he's brain dead, I'm not still 100% convinced that that is the case. You mean I'm not happy based on his consultations with doctors here in Israel in Sha'arei Tzedek. I'm still not absolutely comfortable with that pronouncement. You follow? Because brain death is not something I can measure. It's not like a pulse. Well, he's writing 30 years ago. It could be that it's different today. The only thing we know is when the heart stops beating. We go back to the Chatam Sofer. That feels like death. You know what I mean? The body goes cold. You can feel that the soul has left the body. You follow? It's very hard for me, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, to see, like a beating heart, someone on an artificial ventilator, and to see them as dead. Meaning, I suppose it's more intuitive, the position of the Chatam Sofer. You follow? Once the heart stops bleeding, I'd wait for another 30 seconds. Like the Chatam Sofer, once he's gone hard, the body's gone cold, everything's hard, then I would be confident to say the person's dead. I'm saying this based on information that I heard from 3 senior doctors. As I said, he was a consultant for many of the doctors in Sha'arei Tzedek, and based on the information they told him, he's reverting back to the position of the Chatam Sofer. You follow? Afal Piken, al Mishmarti Emda, Kamo Shekatit, Kodem She'en Lismoch, בוודאות על המדע הרפואי, כל זמן שעדיין יש פעימות לב, אף שקרוב לוודאי שזה רק מפני המכשיר בלבד. Nevertheless, I'm going to stay strong on my position and I'm going to say that I would not base myself on medical knowledge as long as the heart is still pumping. Meaning, the only way I can know for sure that someone is dead is when the heart stops beating. It goes back to the position of the Khatam Sofer. Now, he does leave a little opening here, because he says, I want to be sure. And the medical readings at his time, 30 years ago, could not say for sure. But it could be that, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, that at a time in the future where I could be sure, using a measure other than the heartbeat stopping, he may then accept that as a definition of death. You follow? Basically saying, I have to be sure. And I'm either going to go by halakha or not, or intuition. I don't know if that's the right word. You know what? You don't need a halachic source for the position of the Khatam Sofer, because that's obvious. You understand? It's obvious that person is dead. So I don't need to look for a source in halakha to support the position of the Khatam Sofer, because I can look at this person and then, Rahman al-Islam, the heart stops beating. It's clear. You don't need to be a doctor to understand that this person's left this world. You can see this person's no longer with us. You follow? But the position of Rav Moshe Feinstein requires much more. It's a much bolder position, and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, doesn't feel that we have the halachic. The halachic.
Authority.
Yeah, authority. Is that the right word? Yeah, to make such a bold new definition of death. Is that clear? So, sweet, wonderful people, I want to summarize. We looked at 3 stages of the story. The first stage was the stage of the Mishnah. Mishnah followed by the Gemara about the Mapolet, about the avalanche that landed on somebody. And according to the Mishnah, the Gemara, and then the Shulchan Aruch, it's all about the nose. It's all about breathing. If someone is breathing, the nose, they're breathing, they're alive. Okay, that was the definition. It becomes very difficult to define. Like you said, sometimes people would stop breathing, and then half an hour later, the resuscitation is possible, right? So it's a very difficult measure. But that was the measure that they had, understandably, with much more primitive medical knowledge than we have today. So I understand why that was the measure to see whether someone was alive or not until the 17th century, right? But then we got to the 18th century, and you got to Mecklenburg, and people were being buried alive, and it was a disaster. And said, we're going to have to wait for 3 days. And then the Khatam Sofer came to a new definition. Not the definition that we saw in the Mishnah of somebody who stopped breathing, because maybe they might stop breathing. I don't know if they stopped lachalutin. The only way I know it stopped for sure is if the heart starts beating and the body goes cold and it becomes hard like stone. Then I know it's irreversible. You follow? But that's like intuitive. I don't need to wait 3 days, but once that happens, they're dead, and then we can bury them. We're not going to wait 3 days. That's the Khatam Sofer. Based on that sort of halachic journey, we see the first modern Psak Halacha, and that's Rav Eliezer Waldenberg says, we're going to follow the Khatam Sofer, and we're going to say, as long as the body is hard and cold, then we know they've left this world. But before that, we won't allow organ donation. That's the strictest opinion. No playing around. Then we have the position of Rav Moshe Feinstein, which is the other extreme. Originally, he was strict, but then after this new drug, he became more lenient. Based on information that he got from his son-in-law, he came up with a new definition of death, which is really based on stuff that we know now that we never knew 100 years ago. Brain death is like decapitation. So we are discovering things that people never knew about in previous generations, and with our new information, we can give a new definition of what death is. That the heart could still be beating, but as long as there's no connection, as long as the brain is irreversibly ceased functioning, then they're dead. So Rav Moshe Feinstein and his son-in-law allow organ donation because we know stuff today that people never knew before. You follow? That's position number 2. And then position number 3, which is sort of in between the two, is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who says, I hear what Rav Moshe Feinstein says, but I'm still not convinced that the doctors can accurately read the situation and declare somebody dead when the heart is still beating and like the body might still be functioning. To be able to say with such certainty that the person is dead, I, based on his consultation with 3 doctors, don't want to take that leap, says Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. But what's interesting and what distinguishes Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, say both him and Rav Eliezer Waldenberg both say no, but it's a different type of no. Rav Eliezer Waldenberg is a blanket no. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is, at the moment, I'm just not happy. But if in a future time I would be happy, then maybe he would also have allowed organ donation, when someone is still, when the heart is still beating. But when he was writing, he didn't feel he could say that. Sweet, wonderful people. I hope Be'ezrat Hashem we should all live till Biat Goel Be'ezrat Hashem, and therefore this is not a relevant topic for us, but it is an exciting exploration of modern halachic authorities trying to grapple with a new situation. And you see, like some are more conservative, or you see the boldness of Rav Moshe Feinstein, based on information from his son-in-law, the way that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach sort of navigates this tricky situation. I hope Be'ezrat Hashem, our study of this complicated topic allows us to appreciate the greatness of Gedolei Yisrael even more.
Amen.
Yishar Koach to everybody.
Good luck.